Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you're logging into us from. We're so happy to have you join us today for our Global Scholars and Innovators panel discussion on the future of global higher education. Welcome. We're very excited to have you join us today. My name is Monroe Friends, and I'm the Associate Vice President for Global Engagement and Inclusive Leadership at New York University's Office of Global Inclusion, Diversity, and Strategic Innovation, or what we commonly refer to as the Office of Global Inclusion. Before we get started today, we want to let you know that we have closed caption available. You can access captions by pressing the CC closed caption button that's at the very bottom of the screen today. And then you should be able to start seeing the closed caption. If there's a problem with that, please just message one of our team members and we can respond and assist you to ensure that you have closed caption. We will also be taking live questions today from our panelists, which they will answer later during the discussion. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function, which again is at the bottom of your screen, and we will be doing our best to get to as many of your questions as possible. When you submit your questions, please indicate if your question is for a particular panelist. Please also note that this program is being recorded and will be posted later to our OGI website with other recorded programs and discussions. So before we get started today, I also like to take a moment to acknowledge and recognize and thank those on our OGI team that have helped to bring together today's discussion. And as well, thank you to all of our esteemed panelists for saying yes and for joining us today. Moreover, I would also like to thank all of our frontline and essential workers all around the globe that make it possible for all of us to continue to live and thrive. Thank you for the sacrifice that you've made for all of our well-being, whether that's people in medical professions, people who are working, delivering packages, people who are making masks, people who are working in factories or distribution lines, et cetera, to ensure that we have the resources that we need. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you so much. We'd also like to take a moment to thank all of our ancestors, those that have become before us, those who have laid the pathway for all of us to live in the way that we live today. And in particular, we'd like to thank our indigenous peoples all around the world whose land that we now occupy. And with that, and in reflecting on all the lives that we have lost due to anti-Black violence, due to other forms of violence all over the world, and through as well through different forms of genocide, we would like to take a moment of silence for all of those individuals that have come before us that have made our lives possible. If we can just take a moment of silence. So now that we're here today, we are pleased to welcome you again to today's event, a panel on the future of higher education, which is one of the many programs within the Global Scholars and Innovation Series that is a part of our NYU BeTogether strategy and initiative. BeTogether is a change-making effort that was announced in June by NYU President Andy Hamilton, our Board of Trustees, and of course, our very own Senior Vice President, Dr. Lisa Coleman. It is an initiative focused on making global change across all of NYU's global network by innovating, by taking action, and by transforming together. BeTogether builds on the climate assessment that we did a few years ago, where we asked all of NYU, our staff, our faculty, and our students, to reflect on what it was like to live, work, and learn at NYU. And from this foundation of data we've built, we must build, we must grow, and we must continue to imagine where we want to go as a globally dynamic, innovative, diverse, and entrepreneurial community. As a part of today's global conversation, we have 5 topics that we'll focus on, or 5 key areas. The first is global impact, where we will consider the impact across the globe of the pandemic, the impact of racism and racial injustices, or ongoing multidimensional demonstrations, protests, and unrest, and of the overall disruption to our daily lives. The second will focus on partnerships especially in terms of cross-sector, cross-institutional, and international partnerships. The third topic we've asked our panelists to focus on in our conversation today is leadership in a time of crisis. And we have some of the most brilliant leaders with us in conversation today to reflect on this question. We've asked them to think about where will we learn, what have we learned, and where are we about to go when we think about leadership, dealing especially during difficult times. The fourth topic, of course, coming out of the Office of Global Inclusion, is important for us to as well discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion, where our panelists will share their perspectives on how to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, in our day-to-day work. And our final topic will be the use of technology for advancing change. Where will we go? Where will we get to hear from our panelists about the potential of technology helping us to make impact and using technology as a way to advance growth and accessibility. And so I want to thank you again, all of our panelists. Thank you again to the OGI teams, many of whom are working behind the scenes to make this program possible for us today. And without any further ado, I would like to introduce my friend, my colleague, my mentor, Professor Teboho Moja. I have now had the pleasure of working with her for many, many years and have traveled all over the globe with Professor Moja. Dr. Teboho Moja is a clinical professor of higher education at NYU and an extraordinary professor at the University of Western Cape, South Africa, and a visiting research fellow at the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria, one of our partner for today's event. She previously served as the Executive Director and Commissioner of the National Commission on Higher Education in South Africa in 1995, and was appointed by President Mandela. She has published extensively on higher education policy, presented numerous keynote addresses at international conferences on higher education. And before coming to NYU, Professor Moja served as the special advisor to the Minister of Education. Teboho has served on numerous committees, advisory boards, and boards of international bodies such as UNESCO and the councils of universities in South Africa. In 2010, she was appointed visiting professor at the University of Oslo, Norway, and University of Tampere, Finland. And in 2017, she was a visiting professor at the University of Hong Kong. And one of the other things that is not mentioned here is that she is one of our distinguished faculty who have received the NYU MOK Faculty Award. So without any further ado, I want to introduce to you Dr. Professor Teboho Moja, our moderator for today.
Thank you, Monroe, for this wonderful introduction and a reminder of some of the things I've done in life. You know, life goes on and you forget some of the things you have done. Thank you for our esteemed panelists, as well as our keen participants for this session today. We're really looking forward to a great dialogue that we'll have that will also help us think more about what the future of higher education looks like. Well, the year 2020 has brought many unprecedented changes across the globe. We all look forward to it disappearing soon and hopefully taking with it all the problems that it came with. Within the higher education sector, the historic health and economic setbacks caused by the pandemic have influenced the way in which we now interact with our students and colleagues, right? And the way we carry out the mission of our institutions. Colleagues, we all agree that the pandemic has caused great disruptions within education, the impact of which is not yet fully understood, especially today as the globe confronts another spike in infections, just as we thought we have all in control. We have, in addition, we have had protests and civil unrest, most recently invigorated by incidents of violence and racism against Black people globally. Those disruptions have brought racial justice and anti-racism to the forefront at many of our institutions. Students have been calling on our educational leaders to take on racial and class inequity challenges and create more inclusive campus climates. Of course, this is not new to higher education. And in the past, the sector has been flexible and adaptive in response to global changes. Today, this remains the case, and we have seen how many of our institutions have been able to adapt to the impact of the pandemic, racial injustices, and other disruptions. Now, let me introduce our panelists who will explore how the current context is shaping the future of higher education and help us reflect on those issues. Our first panelist today is Dr. Jamshed Baruch. Dr. Bharucha is the founding Vice Chancellor of Sai University in Chennai, India, and the President Emeritus of the Kupe Union in New York. Dr. Bharucha has held multiple leadership posts, including Provost and Senior Vice President of Tufts University and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science at Dartmouth College. Welcome, Dr. Bharucha. The second panelist is our very own Dr. Lisa Coleman, who is the inaugural Senior Vice President for Global Inclusion and Strategic Innovation. She's also the university's Chief Diversity Officer. Previously, Dr. Coleman served as Harvard University's first Special Assistant to the President and its first Chief Diversity Officer. Thank you, Lisa. Our third panelist, I call our own again, in partnership with us, Dr. Tawana Kupe. He's the Vice Chancellor or President, a familiar term here, and Principal of the University of Pretoria, and the Africa Co-Chair of the Australia-Africa Universities Network. Dr. Kupe has served in multiple leadership positions at Wits University. He also received an honorary doctorate in humanities that was bestowed on him by Michigan State University in December last year. Welcome. Our fourth panelist that I want to introduce is Dr. Fumi Olonizakin, who holds 3 titles at King's College London. First, she is the Vice President, she is Vice Principal International, and Professor of Security Leadership and Development. Fumi is a founding member of the African Leadership Center that is based in Kenya. In 2016, the University of Pretoria appointed Fumi as an extraordinary professor in the Department of Political Science. And in 2018, the Director General of UNESCO invited her to join the Council of the United Nations University. Thank you, Fumi. And our final panelist that I want to introduce here is Amy Rutherford, who is the Regional Director of the Americas, the Middle East, and Europe at Education New Zealand, which is part of the New Zealand Embassy in Washington, DC. She's also the counselor, the education counselor, and her day-to-day work involves education diplomacy initiatives and liaison with universities and other international education stakeholders. The goal of this is to advance New Zealand government's objectives around international education, promotion of New Zealand as an education destination, and the support of international efforts in New Zealand. So thank you and welcome, Amy. So thank you all for being here and being ready to really start us on this dialogue that we have planned for today. So I want to start our discussion today with a more general question to all of you that includes your reflections on some of the things that have been happening. So I want you to reflect on the period since March and tell us and share with us how you envision the future of higher education in addressing social problems and in making a contribution to social change and transformation. And for this starting part, just 1 minute reflection or so from each one of you. So maybe we can start with Jamshed.
Thank you, Professor Moja. And thank you to the organizers of this NYU event. Since the beginning of the pandemic, of course, everything has been turned on its head. I do think that if there's a silver lining for the kinds of issues we are discussing on this panel, it is an increasing comfort with people communicating online. Before the pandemic, there was certainly much more resistance to doing that. I think a lot of that will carry over beyond the pandemic in teaching, in learning, in bringing communities across the globe together as we have come together today in this wonderful forum. Obviously, there are serious issues of inclusion when we try to bring people together online, and that's a range of access or lack thereof to Wi-Fi, to the kinds of laptops and cell phones that would support communication, as well as the fact that many students who are less well off don't necessarily have their own rooms. And if they're getting their education from home, they're in a home with a lot of family members together. So there are some very important challenges we need to reflect on. We must provide fast bandwidth to all students around the world, regardless of their ability. And I think that once we come back from the pandemic, we will have learned from this experience. And hopefully we have a new technological tool for promoting inclusion, for promoting diversity in every aspect of our universities.
Thank you very much for those comments. And since we have a theme on diversity, equity, and inclusion, we'll elaborate further when we get to that. So may I direct the same question to Lisa, please?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be on this panel. And of course, thank you to my entire team and everyone in the background at NYU for putting this together. Yes, so let me piggyback on some of the things that Jamshed was saying. Obviously, we're seeing a shift in terms of the acceleration of the digital world and digital learning and remote learning, and that has had differential impacts, as Jamshed mentioned. I do think that some of the silver linings in terms of thinking about social change and transformation are that many people turn to higher ed when there are challenges such as these. They turn to higher ed because of the research that we offer. So if we think about the COVID-19 pandemic, certainly we have a School of Global Public Health and many, many researchers obviously working on the varying aspects of the differential impacts, whether that's the health crises, whether that's the sociological or psychological, if we think about mental health issues and the anxiety, of course, and the impact that's happened. I also think that the silver lining is we have a lot of people in the generations, whether that's the Generation Z or the millennials or the emerging generations, which are the alphas, who are actually out there who we know that when we look at the kinds of things that have been happening globally in terms of whether those were protests or redress and address to the kinds of violence, xenophobia that you mentioned earlier, a lot of the generations are just out there. And so we have an ability to work with them as new leaders and as emerging leaders to think about solving complex problems. And then the last thing I'll just say is that I think that when we think about the issues that Jamshed mentioned around broadband access, et cetera, I think that we also have some interventions that we can make in terms of thinking about technology and global sector partnerships, which are one of the reasons I'm so excited about this panel. But if we think about global partnerships and cross-sector partnerships, we're also seeing the acceleration of those. So corporate, higher education, and governmental entities coming together in new ways to solve some of these problems.
Thank you. So you raise very important issues that hopefully in the dialogue we're having, we'll elaborate a little further on those. So may I turn to Tawana now to respond to my initial question?
You're still muted, Tawana.
Wait,
I do it all the time.
The statement of the year, I was muted, you are muted, unmute yourself. So thank you, Teboho, and I'm privileged to be on this platform here today. I think that the pandemic is reminded of something we were not fully aware of, that we live in an age of multiple continuous disruptions. And these disruptions are political and social, technological and economic, ecological and environmental. It has also, I think, provided an opportunity for us to address the question, or to address rather the rumors, which are exaggerated, that the death of higher education is imminent. As my two colleagues have said, higher education has been able to demonstrate its relevance at this time, but also, in turn, higher education has been able to understand its limitations and also provide an opportunity for us to rethink and reimagine and reposition higher education. In what ways? I think we've taken for granted our impact in society and tended to measure it in the traditional metrics of H indexes, citations, field medals, Nobel Prizes, and so on. Those are very important. And they're an important and legitimate recognition of scholarly knowledge. But we need to do much more on societal impact. And this is the opportunity, because the pandemic is a global societal challenge never known before, and knowledge is key to it. But it cannot be done through the traditional university. It has also taught us both the possibilities and limitations of online education. And I think, in my view, it has taught that the future is not just purely online. The future is a nuanced, graduated hybrid between fully online contact and social, depending on degree programs and research agendas. So it's a great moment to rethink the future. It's exciting for me. And I repeat, the deaths of higher education, or rumors thereof, are greatly exaggerated.
Thank you. I look forward to an elaboration on some of those thoughts. Disruptions are not always bad. They are a way of making us pause and rethink and reimagine what we're doing. Let me turn on to Fumi for that initial question.
Thank you so much. Let me also say how delighted I am to be a part of this panel, and I want to thank my colleagues who organized this for thinking of me for it. I think really when I think of this context, I see a future of higher education that is extremely dynamic. I want to underscore, I agree with many of the points that have been made, but a dynamic future in which finally we can study developing societies as they really are instead of as they ought to be. At least in my field, this global ideological framework that we take into places like Africa or Latin America, in our parts of the developing world, where we have already preconditioned certain ideals, neoliberal development, neoliberal peace, with templates that hardly ever apply to those societies. For once, we can see a new generation of people. Lisa was talking about Generation Z, having seen the ways in which they have interacted, communicated transnationally, and that has been revealed during the COVID period. They did that previously, but it wasn't at a center stage. So we will see a new community of future people, future leaders who would change the way in which we research them. I'm excited about that. I think technology will make it possible. We just now really need to enable it. Thank you.
Thank you, Fumi. It's not all doom and gloom. There is hope and there are great opportunities. Thank you. And I'll take our last panelist, Amy, to give your opening comments here.
Well, I want to add my thanks for the invitation to this panel too. It's great to be with people from across the world, and more than sort of one representative from the Southern Hemisphere is always good as well. So also kia ora tātou, hello everyone who's joined us today. And when I think about this question, I think about how if there's anything in the past months have taught us, is it's how humanity's big challenges are global in nature, and they require coordinated effort from across the world to solve. So this means that higher education institutions across the world, with their globally connected faculty, their global research, their global relationships, and increasingly globally educated student cohort, I think they're uniquely positioned to tackle these challenges, these big challenges that we have, this kind of continual disruption that we have. So whether or not it is social and environmental, climate, health, whatever, I think this is, you know, that, yeah, you're right, Tawana, the death of higher education, it's not going to happen, hopefully.
Thank you, Amy. So as we look at what's happening for months now, higher education has felt the impact of the global health crisis, compounded by continued pervasive violence against historically marginalized communities, which affects many of our students, staff, and faculty. And Lisa, you started touching on some of those issues in your introductory response. My question to you is, what are some of the longer lasting global impacts on higher education? And what are some potential opportunities that have come up?
So as people have already mentioned, obviously, we're seeing the acceleration, as I said earlier, in terms of digitization and connections globally. So as we think about the political and social unrest that's taken place globally, to go back to some of the things that some of my fellow panelists have said, people are connected. And so they are able to create and mobilize in ways that we had never seen. The other, of course, is that we know this from history, and certainly during the 1960s, social media in the United States was used as a platform, right, to bring people out to address issues around civil rights and justice. And that's exactly what we're seeing again. And so, but we're seeing it in an accelerated pace. And so when I think about we're also seeing the emergence of different types of leaders. And so the traditional leadership trajectories, also when we think about the new generations, they're much more entrepreneurial. They're coming out and solving problems in different ways. And so I think the leadership opportunities and potential are great, as long as we can recognize the emerging leaders as emerging leaders and break free. And this goes back to something that I think Tawana was saying, is about how we can break free of the traditional molds to actually think about innovative spaces where we can create new types of leaders, whether those are leaders bringing indigenous sensitivities, right? And sort of that trajectory, whether there are leaders bringing leadership. If we think about the impact on women during this time and the depression of research, if we can think about how we innovate to really think about the ways that we can deal with disruptions that won't have this kind of differential impact in the future. So I think those are some of the ways. And I'll end by saying this, the leadership shifts that we're seeing also, and certainly in the United States, and I'll just say this, we're seeing lots of people being hired across this sort of diversity and inclusion landscape, and certainly within universities, et cetera. But I do want to say that I do think that one of the things that I have concerns about is how we will make sure that this is embedded continuously within the work that we're doing across higher education. And so if we think about the work certainly coming out of some of the institutions, whether that's the University of Pretoria and other institutions out of South Africa, and thinking about that work of transformation, I think about the transformative possibilities of what is possible in terms of this embedded work. And I think that with COVID-19, we have seen the more global partnerships and more avenues provided for those global partnerships and cross-sector opportunities. And the idea is, how do we continue to sustain those? How is this not just a moment, as people are saying, but a movement as we continue forward?
Thank you. You raise a very important point when you say that we need to look at how we institutionalize the changes that we are bringing to the fore at the moment. Let it not be just for one season, but be something that we embrace, that stays with us. I want to turn to Amy. Amy, do you want to add to what Lisa has already alluded to?
Well, it's interesting to ask that question of a New Zealander, because on the sort of COVID side of things in New Zealand, there was a hard lockdown in New Zealand for 5 weeks at the end of March, and then a sort of lower level lockdown again in August. And this has meant that New Zealand has effectively eradicated community transmission of the virus. But in saying that, I woke up this morning and I saw a report of a person in Auckland has tested positive for the virus yesterday. So, you know, there's still obviously, you know, some of the virus coming in across the border. But that eradication of the virus, in effect, meant that New Zealand institutions very quickly went back to normal. So yes, they moved online like universities across the world did during the lockdown, but they very quickly went back to in-person provision. So and except for sort of smaller numbers of international students on campus, there hasn't been the same kind of sort of months-long effect of shutdowns and students not being able to come into classes in the same way there has been in many different parts of the world. So when I think about opportunities though, when I think about impacts and opportunities, obviously New Zealand institutions have been tremendously affected by COVID. But an opportunity I see, and I'm going to preface this by saying that I think I'm the only one in the panel that doesn't work at a university. So, you know, I can look out from the outside in on this. And when I think about universities, sometimes I think about them as being kind of behemoths, you know, kind of like conservative and resistant to change. But during this period, I think universities being forced to move online quite literally overnight, they've shown that they can be nimble, which is not a word that I usually associate with universities, and they can change and change quickly. And even in the New Zealand context, when they quickly went back to in-person provision, they've taken advantage of what they learned about going online by increasing those levels of blended and online learning. And that ties back to something Tawana was saying. He hoped that they would become more nuanced. There'll be more different kinds of learning that happens at the universities. And I think that's an opportunity. There's also an opportunity for development of meaningful virtual options. So rather than using technology as kind of a catch-all last resort, instead, you know, we need to think about ways we can meet students where they already are, using what they're already familiar with. So using different platforms to reach students, whether or not that's kind of like, I don't know if we can have TikTok learning, but, you know, that's where students are at the moment. And on that kind of meaningful virtual options side of things as well, in terms of the kind of new impacts that the COVID environment has had on education and kind of partnership and global engagement. So Education New Zealand facilitated a partnership between the University of Maryland's College Success Scholars that serves Black and Latino men, and we worked with them to partner with the Auckland University of Technology's Indigenous Studies Department. And this program, this partnership aims to develop courses where Māori students in New Zealand and UMD scholars learn together what leadership in marginalised populations looks like, both in New Zealand and in the US. And the long-term goal of that partnership is to develop curricula on both sides and being taught in 2 different countries in these classes at the same time, and have engagement between the universities built into that course as well. And I think that's a real opportunity going forward as well. What we're kind of like coming up with now is going to have those real impacts on students learning for the future.
Thank you. You are leading us to an important issue, partnerships, that it's a nice segue to start looking at partnerships, especially in the context of many of our schools, colleges, and universities operating remotely. We have had the opportunity to rethink how we develop those partnerships. So my question is, what is the role of global partnerships in a reimagined future of higher education? How can cross-sector and cross-institutional partnerships help institutions lead social change and transformation? And I would like to pick up from where you left off, Amy, on the issue of partnerships and with your role in the New Zealand Embassy promoting partnerships or so. So if you could respond to that.
Yeah, so with COVID, the New Zealand government, we worked to develop a recovery plan for international the international education sector, because I specifically work on the international education side of things. And this recovery plan is a long-term plan which aims to reset New Zealand's international education sector and also lay the foundations for a more resilient, diverse and sustainable future of international education in New Zealand. And central to that recovery plan is a need to build deep reciprocal relationships with other countries, other education providers, other partners, education partners, whatever they are. And the aim is to increase resilience and uncover opportunities for innovation. That's what the plan talks about. And I think when I say that, one word really stands out to me as being key, and that is reciprocity, developing reciprocal relationships. Because I think in the past, when I look at partnership development around the world, there's been a lot of flow of people and talent from the global south to the global north. And so we're looking at we're rethinking at the moment what we see as an equitable reciprocal partnership. And partnerships and relationships between faculty, scholars, academics around the globe, around global issues and problems which play to the strengths of those different locations and institutions and faculty members are key. When I was discussing this panel with my Education New Zealand colleague, Du Bois Jennings, who I think may be on the, who maybe have called in today, when I talked to him about this panel, he said to me that many of the partnerships that he's observed in the past and the work that he's done in international education are one of two kinds. One is the kind of traditional, hefty, bilateral MOU, and the other is kind of like ad hoc partnerships that come about through a relationship between faculty members. And I think he's right. Like when we're talking about it, I was saying, you know, which is the most valuable partnership to develop between global partners, and he said it was probably the partnerships around a topic which links a global issue while fitting in with an institution's goals. And that's the way that these partnerships can lead to social change. So one's based around a topic where there are different cultural perspectives between two institutions, but they help spark this creative thinking and new solutions to these global issues that we're facing. And these kinds of partnerships drive student participation as well. So a student is much more likely to engage with learning if it's around a topic that they're passionate about. It's facilitated by faculty members with reciprocal links around the world, and it's tying back to real world solutions to problems. And from that kind of engagement with students, I think that's where you get the social change and transformation.
Mm-hmm. An opportunity to rethink partnerships and what kind of partnerships are actually effective. And Tawana, you have had experience in developing partnerships across institutions and across sectors. So may I direct this question to you to share your insights on it?
No, thank you. I mean, on this, exactly where I'm sitting on this very platform, I signed a memorandum of understanding with Lisa Coleman, which were developed offline, and we're looking for a time, physical time, face time to sign. But we decided, no, this is an opportunity to do it differently. So, but that was the first we did, but now I've lost count. I'm writing my report to the Board of Trustees, which is in 2 weeks' time. And it's a whole page of memorandums of understanding that I've signed with universities. The large one we signed, which I want to make an example of, not far from New Zealand, is with Australia Murdoch University. This is, I think, is going to be the standard of how we will go, because it incorporates the values that you mentioned, mutually beneficial and so on. But we also have signed a lot of memorandums of understanding with civil society organizations, and specifically women's organizations in South Africa. And I prioritize that deliberately because we have another pandemic in South Africa, which is also global, I think, of gender-based violence and femicide. It's way beyond control, and it's like a mini civil war, if you like. So in signing partnerships with the civil society organizations, we prioritize those organizations that defend, empower, and enable women. And simply behind this, by the way, is a particular philosophy I have about partnerships and relationships, that they must advance transdisciplinary research. In other words, not only partnerships between academic institutions, nationally, regionally, and globally, but also those partnerships should include within them civil society, governmental agencies that are progressive in their agenda, as well as business where it enables society without a narrow profit motive. So if you saw me this morning, I was taking a group of businessmen through what I call our transdisciplinary research platforms. So we built 4 of these, which is the Future Africa Institute and Campus, Engineering 4.0, all things digital, all things fourth industrial revolution. We built a new art center, which is about memory, history, and culture in Africa and its relationship to the globe. We're building a 4th platform for agriculture called Innovation Africa at UP. The idea here is to break a number of silos, disciplinary silos, research silos, to cross borders and continents and to connect the world, if you like. The digital technologies have been absolutely wonderful. But let me repeat, we've also seen the limitations of such engagements. We cannot just carry on through digital platforms and small screens on our computers. The human dimension, the shaping hand of human interaction is very, very important. Last, with Murdoch University in Australia, what we have signed is a big partnership, which includes transformative leadership, the traditional research, but transdisciplinary research, but also a joint doctoral degree program, which will be taken by Murdoch University students and University of Pretoria students, each still registered in their university, but allowing for regular movements over periods of time. I personally believe that is one of the futures that are possible. We're also going to develop joint courses. Time differences, of course, allowing, we want to schedule such courses. So in 2 weeks' time, we'll have a joint research seminar between researchers at Murdoch University and UP, but we are both in the Australia-Africa Research Network. So we're going to bring in all of the other partners. And Amy, here's the good news. When I gave the keynote address last week, as co-president, I motivated that New Zealand joins the Australia-Africa University Network. That's been accepted in principle. And so, but we then take this further to bring in other networks. So there are networks of networks, partnerships of partnerships, and we really globalize in a mutually beneficial way.
Right, thank you. So partnerships are happening even during this panel dialogue. So Amy, there's the offer for joining these partnerships. So we are saying, or you are mentioning the need to sort of like revisit traditional types of partnerships and also consider multi-party partnerships, basically. And in these situations, leadership becomes very critical. So we need strong and effective leadership, particularly in addressing the many challenges posed during times of crisis, as well as for identifying and leveraging potential opportunities, which Tawana has already touched on a little bit there. What should leaders be doing now to get us through the crisis and to project us actually into the future? And Fumi, this question falls into one of your areas of your research. So we'd like to start with your answer this time.
Thank you. Thanks, Teboho. I think it's important to reflect a little bit on this notion of effective leadership. And in this COVID period, it's been astounding, to see how the question of leadership is one that stands at the core of whether a nation or a university gets their response right or wrong. And it rests on 2 things. It's the leadership infrastructure, the hardware of it, and the software of it. The hardware of it is what we focus our attentions on as universities and as nations most of the time. The nature of our systems, we talk about, whether it's autocratic or democratic. In the case of universities, we look at, the structures. And this is right. But the software of it is something we take for granted because we have adapted. We haven't even adapted. We have really adopted a particular approach to leadership, which typically is top down. And of course, we sit here as presidents and vice presidents and senior vice presidents and so on. But when you look at the software of it, which is entirely relational, this has been the crux of the matter, the test of whether leadership will be effective, whether in a university or in a nation. So where you've had relationships of trust within a country and across society. So if you don't have it within a country, between the government and the people, and you have it across society, see how societies have responded very well. When you have lacked both, you've been doomed. Thankfully, it hasn't exactly been the same. When you look within universities as well, we have been called to action in terms of our relationship to our community, and that community is within the university, our students and staff. Look at how many Black people died within particular communities as a result of COVID. It differs from country to country. But for us in the UK, we've seen how those from working class, and I think Jamshed was referring to that at the start, have suffered more. So I think the future is going to look slightly different if we have learned any lessons from this. That relational aspect has to be the thing that we put at the center of the table. And it's about who is building a relationship. Are we as leaders, are leaders in countries or universities building relationships of trust with their communities around their shared goals, around their shared problems? For our students across NYU, Pretoria, across, in New Zealand, everywhere, we might begin to see a co-constitutive method. We say co-creation, but that we're all working together to solve global problems or to solve our mutual problems. And you see our students sharing ideas and modules and so on. It is a thing that was on the verge of becoming when Macron in France was talking about European Universities Network, but we can suddenly see ourselves with thousands of students shared amongst us, and they haven't left their countries. And yet mobility is taking place. And I agree with Tawana that it's not just about it's not just about the digital. We find the spaces where we still continue to work together once or twice a year. But I think this might help us address this imbalance that Amy was talking about between the global North and the global South. I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but this has been a big problem around partnership. And so maybe more will join us to create a kind of world in which it doesn't matter where you're living, but you're actually able to interact around the problems that you have. And if we see each other, when we see each other in 2 or 3 years, it's like we never left, a relationship. But this is my hope anyway for the future.
Wow, relations in those times and the kind of leadership that will help build relations. So I like the concept of the hardware and software of leadership. I never thought of leadership in that way, but this brings new ideas to my mind. So Jamshed, with your experience in leadership, can you add your insights into this?
Yes, thank you. And I too was intrigued by the Fumi's distinction between hardware and software of leadership. I've written that down. And my field is cognitive neuroscience, and we talk about the brain as being the hardware, but the mind as being the software, and with all the synaptic connections in that. So thank you for that new metaphor. In my experience, the biggest challenge of leadership is knowing when to go along with the most vocal stakeholders versus when to drive initiatives or decisions forward. They aren't always mutually exclusive, and obviously, if they converge, that's the best outcome for all. But in times of crisis, and I've been through all kinds of crises, and this, of course, is a big one. In times of crisis, they tend not to converge. The universities have a wide range of stakeholders. We all know that, all of us who are in universities. You have the students, you have the faculty, you have the parents, you have the alumni, you have the staff, you have the local, the town. Rarely do their interests converge completely, and even within each group, they can be divided down the middle. For leaders, it's really a crisis that brings forth a leader, because you can see your stakeholders may be divided down the middle. And during this pandemic, for example, institution on whose campus I live right now, Dartmouth, even though I'm vice chancellor of a university in India. That's the beauty of online. Is the faculty submitted a petition. They were opposed to the students returning to campus because of concerns about the spread of the coronavirus. The students, of course, overwhelmingly wanted to return to campus. Okay, parents, as far as I can tell, pretty much wanted them to return to campus. They want them out of the house, I suppose. That's the American thing. I think in India, it's the opposite. Parents are much more protective. But in the United States, parents, once you graduate from high school, bye-bye. And the local community was concerned about all these students coming back to campus. Okay. And so I do take my hat off to the current leadership at Dartmouth. I think that they handled this in a very, very thoughtful way. No group of stakeholders is 100% happy. The rules about what students are able to do while they're on campus are fairly stringent, as are the consequences for not doing something like that, having a party or something like that. But complex problems require complex solutions, and you don't typically get complex solutions in times of crisis just by hoping that all constituents will come together. But to have that kind of tension, healthy tension, to make the tension between the different stakeholders a healthy one rather than an unhealthy one, you require the highest level of transparency, consultation, and evidence-based reasoning. Of course, all of which I'll say, have been absent in our national leadership, but that's the premise for making decisions at universities, because leaders do have to sometimes make tough decisions that will rub one or other constituency the wrong way. I would just add that I think Amy used the word nimble. Universities are not nimble by nature. They're the opposite. One of the biggest paradox of the university is that while individual faculty members in their thinking are nimble, are creative, are innovators, are at the cutting edges of thought, the organization is extremely resistant to change. Okay, you want to move the salt shaker from here to there. In the department office, that requires a major, major faculty meeting. I can say that coming from a life as a faculty member, sorry to my colleagues on the faculty, but that's the culture. I think that pandemic has shaken that up a lot, in that it has forced us as teachers, and I have continued to teach, because I think it's important for leaders to lead by example. We have to adapt in our ways of teaching. When you're teaching online, you cannot teach the same way that you teach in class, in part because the students have the internet at their fingertips. All they have to do is nod and smile, and they could be watching videos, they could be checking email, anything they want to. And we all know that. So it calls for all of us, leaders and faculty are definitely leaders, and staff, to step up our game. and to embrace new experimental ways of doing what we do, to run a university, to engage each other, and most importantly, to do our teaching in ways that continue to inspire our students. And the active learning is what I promote. Cognitive neuroscience research is very clear that the traditional monotone lecture, yes, rumors of its death are greatly exaggerated, but I think perhaps those rumors should be proven true. We need to engage our students, and a pandemic really forces us to think about how we teach, what we teach. And I do think leadership calls for leaders like myself challenging the faculty to step up, to rethink how we engage our students and how we um, do research, because they're the ones that we're here to serve, our students and knowledge in general. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Jamshed. When I first started studying higher education and its transformation, there used to be an expression that said, it's easier to move a cemetery than to change higher education. And I'm glad to see that things are changing. And what you're saying is that with the right leadership and with the right relations, as was said earlier on also, it is possible to actually bring about change. So leadership is very critical. Let me now move to another area of interest that we have here, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So increasing diversity of our student body, faculty, and staff, as well as creating a culture and climate of equity and inclusion within our institutions is critical and needed now more than ever. My question is, what concrete steps have your institutions taken to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion on a day-to-day basis, and in aligning it with your institutional priorities? And for this one, I'll start with Tawana, give Jamshed a break, but Jamshed, you can also add to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Teboho. I think that's an interesting question. So the first one that confronted us in relation to diversity and inclusion was actually when we had to move wholesale online. Let me just add a note here is that the University of Pretoria is interesting in that in a previous episode where students in South Africa shut down the universities under the fees must fall protest, the University of Pretoria experimented with wholesale online teaching. However, that is not our preferred philosophy. Our preferred philosophy is hybrid teaching and learning, and we practiced that before the pandemic. So a student is required to go online before class, in class, in contact, in person, they will be online, and they have to go back online after class. So it's a model we've pioneered, and we've pioneered for us and in our sector in South Africa and Africa, and is doing wonders. So we really slightly unhappy we are fully online. But here was the challenge. When we're the hybrid teaching and learning, we're primarily a contact university. Now students were out there, and some, because of racial, economic, and spatial inequalities, did not have access and did not have laptops. When they are on campus, every University of Pretoria student is access to Wi-Fi, computer labs, social learning spaces that they can use. Now we had a situation. So the first thing I did was that we used the principle no student left behind. So instead of starting online as we had agreed within weeks, I stopped starting online and said, we are not going to start until every student has got a laptop or an internet device in their hands. This caused some bit of unease because my university is diverse in terms of social class, race, gender, and geographic origins. But everybody came to the party, which is actually what I find interesting with this university. This is my fourth university. I have not experienced this before, where after it's been decided, people actually line up and implement. So what we did was then to
We lost your sound. Tawana?
Maybe he's having some technical difficulties.
Just as we're talking about technology. So, yeah. So can we move to Jamshed in the meantime? And can someone
Sure.
send a text to, a chat message to Tawana? We'll come back
Sure.
to him.
And I'm happy to yield back to Tawana as soon as he's online. I'll say a little bit about diversity and inclusion in the Indian context. I'm trying to turn my video on, but it's saying I cannot. So let's see. Okay. This is India's moment historically for the country. It is emerging, modern India is emerging confidently from thousands of years of a caste system and centuries of oppressive colonialism. And the reason I'm engaged in education there is that now more than ever, education is going to be key. Half of India's population is under the age of 25, and the population is 1.3 billion. That's a huge number. And we owe it to them to really give them the finest education and the finest opportunities to all sectors. And so the challenges of diversity, of course, are many for a country with that kind of history. I'll talk about, and of course, there are many, many languages. That's another form of diversity, and communal groups, and socioeconomic stratification is much greater than it is in the West. But there are just two things that I'll mention that I've thought a lot about to try to bring a change there. One is in advancing gender diversity, and another is the management culture. Not only bringing diversity into the management culture, but empowering those at the bottom of the management hierarchy. The management hierarchy is much more traditional and rigid than, say, it is in the United States. And I've been working to make sure that young people coming up who are talented and hardworking have an equal shot at leadership positions, whether it's leadership positions in the faculty or on the administrative side. And on the gender side, I've been working hard. This is my second vice chancellorship in India, because I had helped start another university in Andhra Pradesh, an underserved area, and worked hard to make sure that the women, the female students, particularly in engineering and the STEM fields, develop the kind of confidence that they have historically lacked for societal reasons. What we found is we had, in an engineering school, 37% female students at the undergraduate level, which is actually very high, even by American standards in terms of gender diversity. And the students had stronger admissions credentials, the female students stronger, better grades while they were in college in engineering, and yet tended not to be selected for unique kinds of opportunities, such as foreign study programs and other leadership posts. And so I've tried to bring a culture of reaching out. If there are leadership opportunities or other things that students can foreign study, instead of just posting the ad and seeing who applies, and then you have a search committee look at those, we reach out. We ask for nominations from faculty. We ask for nominations from our student services personnel about women who might be well suited or take advantage of some opportunity. That approach to diversity is a new one in the country, but it's absolutely essential. We can't just assume that if we open the doors, the talent will walk in, because there are many sectors of society who have been taught by society not to raise their hands, not to walk through open doors, not to be confident. And I think in a country the size of India, you have a tremendous talent explosion that you could see if you achieve true gender equity.
Yeah, thank you. So we need to be intentional in our efforts to be inclusive and to promote diversity and equity. So Tawana, are you back? So I'm going to move to the next question, and hopefully when Tawana is reconnected, we can revisit some of the issues. So I'm going to move to my next question. And Lisa, given your recent article on disruption, accessibility, and digital literacy for inside higher education, can you start us on the conversation on your reflections on how we might reimagine or use technology to advance social transformation?
Absolutely, thank you. And I do want to say, to echo some of Tawana's comments, obviously we know some of the limits of technology, and we've seen some of those limits during this time. And there are a great number of limits, and I'll talk a little bit about them. But we've also know that there are possible interventions. And so, and I won't go into all the program language. My first degree was in computer science. So we know that designing algorithms and all of that takes a lot. So I won't go down that road. That would be, that's a whole lecture. But I will say this, that when we're thinking about interventions, I think that there are ways that we can start to think about, to go back to some of the things that Jamshed was talking about, women in technology, right? And access, and providing increased access. If we think about broadband and really thinking about how we provide access and working with governments and countries to really think about expanding access in terms of those kinds of things. I think disability, right, in terms of thinking about the ways in which we work with our communities who are members of disability, members of disability communities across racial, ethnic, class, et cetera. And we've seen the acceleration, but also what we've also seen is if we use universal design and universal access to begin to design then our platforms, that will provide greater access to all. And so there are ways that we can begin to operationalize that. I think the other piece, which is you mentioned this, is if we're going to be able to deal with disruption, we have to think about sustainability, and we have to think about the future. And I think that means we really have to engage our emerging leaders. And that goes back to the article that I wrote about co-creation. The other thing that we're seeing, of course, is, I don't know about anyone else, but when this happened, we needed some of the people in Generation Z to teach some of the people in the other generations how to even access, right, some of the new technology. There's a great group in the United States in the state of Arizona called Teeners, and it's teenagers who teach people who are in the baby boomer and plus what we call the maturest generation. So these are all people born, pre-1945, right? How to even use technology. And so I think that if we're going to think about sustainability, and the other reason that this can be super helpful is if we think about new generations who really want to move into entrepreneurial spaces, we can capture and leverage some of that, right, emerging work that they want to do, and really then think about these cross-generational, I think, possibilities and connections. I think the other piece that has already been mentioned, obviously, is then thinking about this space of hybridization in terms of higher ed. And we know that we're seeing the hybridization of higher ed, and the death of higher ed is truly not happening. But what I do think is higher ed does need to be more nimble. And one of the things that I'm so happy about at NYU is we do have large centers for entrepreneurship, innovation, really rethinking and remapping these spaces. And I'll just give a couple quick examples. We created a new maker space in Brooklyn, which brings together 4 different schools, right? And also our campuses in Abu Dhabi and Shanghai to talk about sort of thinking about those global the global partnerships. And then really thinking about bringing the arts, technology, right, media, and engineering together. And no one in this country is really thinking about bringing those disciplines together in spaces to recreate and reimagine, right, higher education, but then reimagine leadership, reimagine these cross connections. The other, we have something called our 370J and our Institute for Public Knowledge. And one of the things that we do in higher education, to go back to what a lot of the panelists have said, is to really think about, right, the production of knowledge. So how do we use technology to rethink these productions of knowledge, and also to rethink power? Because when we think about relationships of the production of knowledge, to go back to something that Jamshed was saying, we also have to think about these power relationships in higher education that are often cemented. And so if we're going to disrupt and really think about advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, we also have to think about how we use technology, right, to disrupt even certain power relationships. And that goes back to thinking about knowledge production in this hybrid space, which means emerging leaders, emerging new subject areas that we can tap into, right? And meaning emerging and interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work that we can then lean into more, that's much more transformative, as opposed to the sort of traditional ways we've thought about disciplinary wars, et cetera, that I think Tawana and some other people have mentioned. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and welcome back, Tawana.
Yeah.
And you were just talking to us about
You're muted, Teboho.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Tawana. So thanks. We were just talking about some of the changes you are bringing about in your institution to address diversity, equity, and inclusion. And while you're gone, we started talking about technology. And since your comments were related to technology, you could share with us how you reimagine the use of technology for social transformation.
Okay, so sorry about that. Know what happened? I was knocked out. But just my point was the following: is that we all talk about the digital divide as a theoretic concept. Actually, at the beginning of the pandemic, I faced that particular. What I was trying to say is that we brought in the community to contribute to bridge the digital divide. We got in also our donors and alumni. We repurposed institutional funds. I thought that there were 10,000, 15,000 out of the 55,000 students we had. It turned out they were only under 4,000. But even if there were 100, I wanted to dramatize that point to the community, that inclusion is not a theoretic concept, that economic inequality is not a theoretic concept, and that when we say no student left behind to build a more just South Africa, these are the real situations we face. So I think that lesson was learned. I predicated it on the Anti-Discrimination Act we passed last year. Most people didn't think about it when this happened. I said, here is the test as to whether we are really anti-discrimination. Are we going? Because some people argued, including faculty, those students without laptops, they will join when they can find one. I said, no, you can't put the burden on them. This is a result of our history and our economic inequalities. So I think now there's greater appreciation in the university what inclusion means, what inequality means, but now we've moved together very smoothly. Let me just end this by saying, what are the concrete outcomes of driving inclusion, which was both racial and economic and geographic in this instance? Most students attended online, synchronous and asynchronous classes. Most students wrote exams, and in some disciplines, most students did better than they did with face-to-face examinations. And we've eliminated the element of possible plagiarism and cheating. We have charged students who plagiarized and cheated. So, but I think what is the moral of the story here is that technology, we must be careful, comes with the digital divide. The digital divide on technology can be layered on racial, gender, geographic, and economic inequalities. We have to address all forms of inequality and really drive real social justice. Now the community is much happier and they think that we did very, very well. But when we started, some wanted to leave others behind. And
Thank
so
you.
technology is not a
Yeah.
magic wand. It is actually a double-edged sword. And in Africa, it's beautiful for me to speak like this. There are universities in South Africa and Africa that have yet to reopen since the pandemic because they don't have the online infrastructure and resources.
Yes. Thank you. I'm going to move to the live question and answers, and they are related to this. And Fumi, I'm going to start with you with this one that's on eliminating disparities in terms of technology access or so. And the question is, what are the challenges to doing something like this to level the playing field and eliminating disparities, whether in the context of the US, UK, or wherever? So you can take it from any perspective. What does, the question goes on to say, what's the cost of our infrastructure construction goals that include fiber optic technology and so on for the marginalized communities? You are muted.
That's amazing, because actually, if I was going to respond on the question of technology, I was going to pick up. By the way, I loved Lisa's intervention, and Tawana and I are on the same page. Jamshed made some really, really excellent points as well, but Tawana and I are on the same page about the African context. And I would have wanted to intervene on this digital divide, which goes to the question of disparity you just raised, looking at North-South. And of course, I agree, in the South itself, we have North-South divides, in the same way that in the North, we have North-South divides. So in any country, you have, really a slew of excluded groups. It's just that the nature of the exclusion is slightly different when it comes to technology. So someone in my village in Nigeria might still have some analog phones. By the way, a lot of young people, Generation Z, I love Lisa's point around this. Also, they find any means to get the smartphones anyway. But the point is, when it comes to delivery of education, the scale of the divide can be enormous unless we consciously tap into the ways in which we offer leadership. And so what am I saying? On the North-South one, if we're going to partner, King's partners with a university in Somaliland. We have done so for about 15 years now, since the end of their own war. We've had to adapt to low bandwidth technology to deliver medical education. So at King's, everything is state of the art. Actually, talking about leadership infrastructure and the hardware, we were just lucky that we transformed our own technology and systems when we had a major crisis a few years ago. And so COVID made us prepared. But had COVID come 5-6 years ago, we may not have been as prepared as we are now. But we still have to invest in low bandwidth technology if we don't want to leave a student in Somaliland behind. So that's part of what we need to think of. The second point to make there, which I think is important, is in how we invest and how we partner. Tawana made that point. South Africa, I saw it in Kenya and Nigeria. We had to get the mobile phone companies to give data to students. In parts of Nigeria, it had to be a solar phone, which could be charged under the sun every day. They had to be given data. And that thing renews only the next time 1 week later when they get into a space where there's connectivity. Therefore, who are the people that are likely to partner the most? So it's the private sector in country with universities, but it also means, mind you, the advanced country in the global north that is ready to invest in low bandwidth technology and solar can technology. It makes China a big player in this field. And so the kinds of contestations, and if the US, UK, the Western, traditional allies are going to be part of making change in Africa, in parts of Asia, and so on, we have to think differently about technology and about balancing the 5Gs with the, G3s or whatever else exists out there. New thinking is required. But this question is a very important one.
Thank you very much, Fumi. And I'm going to direct the next question to Amy, and since it has to do with student mobility. And now that international students are studying online and can access education online, do you think there will be less student mobility in the long term, or is it a short-term kind of trend that you're seeing? Your speculation on that.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked a lot about the reports of the death of higher education being greatly exaggerated. I wonder if we could say the same thing about international student mobility. But when I think about international student mobility, I also think that the modern kind of international student mobility, which is the kind of huge flow of students from China, only really started 20 years ago. So we're thinking about only 20 years of history there. So we don't have a long time to kind of look back to. And in the early 2000s, like maybe 2001, there were more Chinese students in New Zealand than there were in the United States. So that kind of tells you how fast things changed. And I when I think about why students go overseas, a lot of the time to do undergraduate degrees, which is kind of like the backbone of modern international student mobility, is because in the Chinese student context, there was a large number of students who came into the higher education system at the time there wasn't quality options for them, so they started traveling overseas. So I wonder if short-term student exchange and graduate study existed before that, and I wonder whether or not we'll be going back to more like that. People are staying in country for undergraduate education opportunities, and then doing a shorter term kind of period offshore and maybe a graduate degree offshore as well.
Okay, thank you. So the last one, I'll leave it to who wants to answer it. It has to do with global campuses. NYU seems to be the right direction to point it to, but that it seems that universities with global campuses were better able to decrease the declining number of international students due to the pandemic. And the question is whether you think the trend of opening global campuses would continue post-pandemic, or is the answer in internationalization? Maybe Lisa and whoever else wants to do that. Mm-hmm.
Well, we have seen, and I'll piggyback on some of the things that Amy was saying, that, right, in terms of the history of sort of exchange and international education, right, it's relatively new in the ways in which we're thinking about doing it. And so there gives us an opportunity to be nimble in the ways in which we move forward. And I think if we think about what we've done here at NYU, we have seen actually our international students, faculty, staff still want to participate, travel, et cetera. And so we created something called Go Global, Go Local. And so people are able to go to our local sites. As you know, we're in 145 different countries. And so they are able to go to the local sites to actually, whether those are our research centers or our sites or campuses. And then that is also helping with access issues in terms of some of the things that people were talking about in terms of technology, et cetera, but it's allowing people to be able to do that. So I think what we might see is some shift in the ways in which we define internationalism or this sort of idea of global education, and then how we make meaning of that, which goes back to some of the things that some of the few other panelists were saying, which is then it might also help us create deeper connections cross country, cross government, et cetera, because it allows us, right, to really think about those local contexts in that go global, go local framing. And I can turn it over, maybe Jamshed, I don't know who else, or Tawana.
Okay, Jamshed?
Yes, thank you. So I will talk briefly about the Indian perspective here. For Indians, international and global education has typically meant going abroad, going out of India, and the destinations have been, the obvious ones: US, UK, increasingly now Australia, New Zealand, and but India is now developed the confidence and the infrastructure to be a host nation and a destination. Our university, Sai University, is committed to being a truly global, truly outstanding, interdisciplinary, comprehensive university in one of the great cities in India, Chennai. But there are many other efforts underway in India. There's an explosion of new private universities in India just in the last few years. And by and large, all committed to being global centers, to having more of an international student body than was the case before. As Lisa says, yes, there has to be a local flavor, and there should be a local flavor. We want our Indian students to understand and their own Indian culture and context. But I think there's also a lot that others can learn by coming to India, and I'm sure the same is true of Africa and other parts of the world. So I think that global and international universities, I think their locations are going to be much more diversified around the world.
Thank you very much. Time is against us. There's never enough time when we're having too much fun. And your contributions have been really, really wonderful. So I want to hand over to Lisa to just wrap up for us and thank everybody.
Thank you so much, Teboho. Thank you for this excellent moderation, for the excellent facilitation of questions, both initial questions and of course from our audience. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you. You have been terrific. It has been wonderful to be in conversation with you all. And as you know, I'm in partnership with so many, and we want to expand those partnerships. And please visit our website. We have additional, if you'd like to share this video with your community, colleagues, etc. And I think we should just create a road show. So who knows, maybe we'll be back, the group of us again at some point. Please take good care out there. I know we're over time, but I just want to say, let's try to be nimble. Let's think about our partnerships. Let's think about how we, address these disparities and issues and divides and how we come together. And thank you for coming together for this great discussion. Thank you to all the people who also came to listen. And lastly, of course, thank you to all the people behind the scenes who actually made this possible. Please take good care out there, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.